This episode of the e-commerce playbook is brought to you by Richpanel. Their AI-powered customer support allows you to 10x your customer support volume instantaneously without sacrificing quality. Check them out at richpanel.com.
Welcome back to another episode of the e-commerce playbook podcast, State of the Industry edition. And today we're going bigger than a month. We're going an entire first half recap. This is our biannual edition, a mega episode. We are looking at the entirety of the first half of 2024 in e-commerce, comparing it against the first half of 2023 to try and answer the burning question of how are we as an industry doing. And today I'm gonna hand off the remote control, the quarterback's chair, to Mr. Jeremiah Prummer, who is going to drive this episode for us. We all take turns here at the D2C Index, kind of quarterbacking and leading these editions, and this one has been his love effort here. So he's going to play moderator for us today. So with that, to handle the intros and setup, I'm going to hand it over to the CEO of NoCommerce, Jeremiah.
All right, thanks, Taylor. Since you handed it off to me, I'll go ahead and introduce myself real quick. For anybody who doesn't know, I am Jeremiah Prummer, founder, CEO of NoCommerce. And just as a recap, we work with about 4,000 brands who run surveys on our platform, and we're looking at lots of different big picture trends across that data. The one that we typically are looking at, and that we'll cover a little bit here in the biannual issue, is looking at gifting data. So we've been tracking that throughout this year. We've got some interesting trends there. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to Steve. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Steve Reekook, Director of Data at Common Thread Collective, and I aggregate a lot of the data that we look at, build a lot of the models that we have, and one of which is working with Jeremiah and the data from NoCommerce and building a DTCC, direct-to-consumer specific consumer confidence index.
Awesome, thanks, Steve. And Yarden, to you.
Hey, yeah, I'm the CEO of Veros. Veros provides KPI benchmarking on digital marketing and the revenue trends. We have 7,000 brands in our co-op. It's basically anonymized, aggregated, first-party data. All the data is updated in real time, and that's where we're pulling out these insights from.
Awesome, cool. So as we're looking at what we're seeing for trends in 2024, Yarden, let's go ahead and stick with you. I know everybody is interested in ad performance. So would love to know a little bit about what you're seeing so far this year.
Yeah, we've had a few episodes here where we've commented that things are actually, despite sentiment, quite good. So basically spend is up on Meta and on Google, and ROAS is actually also up, specifically on Meta, which is, the bigger behemoth in this category. CPM is slightly up, but ROAS has also improved about 5%. So on Meta, say there's a 30% spend increase year over year with a 5% ROAS increase, which is very impressive. But to think about, to put this in context and to add a layer on from what we've been reporting, we were trying to figure out, okay, it's up 5%, ROAS is up 5%, but from what base, right? So when we compare it, what was this like in 2023? Was 2023 a good year? Was 2022 a good year? And so when we look at it, what happened was 2021 was a great year in e-commerce and also in ad performance. They go together. 2022 was pretty abysmal, a year, nearly 40% drop in ROAS. And then we're still on the comeback from that really tough year, and we're not back where we were. So 2023 had a 40% back up, but 40% down and 40% up are two different things. So, nearly 80% of the way of where we were. And, for the increase of 5%, it still means that we're far away from where we were, and we may never get back to it. But these increases, it's a positive sign, but it still is on a relatively shaky base after a couple years of struggles here. So we're coming back, but we want to be better than where we were.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm curious too, when we look at some of the commentary from what brands are seeing, especially looking at February and March and some of the significant decline in ROAS there. Do you have any thoughts on what the data is telling us that could be causing those things and what the actual impact is for brands?
Look, I mean, from our from our analyses and the way that we look at numbers from a macro perspective, like for these purposes, we look at like what are the trends across Google, across Shopify. And actually, there hasn't been a significant impact. Like the big story in February, for the vast majority of advertisers, didn't get affected, and actually their performance, as we said, increased. Their performance improved. We did see an unusual amount of advertisers that significantly struggled, and they had real experiences that were tough. But for the most part, most weren't affected, and like the broad set of data actually is on the improvement. And the reason for that, I think we can all lend a hand into. I think as the ad platforms are becoming more automated and more AI based, there are bugs in software. Every algorithm change that you make has an effect, and it's not as optimized as it would be. And these are, causing a lot of fluctuations in very random scenarios. That's the one thing with AI too, is in February, for example, you saw a lot of very random effects, like fans all shifting to Android for a certain advertiser, or everything shifting to Reels, but it wasn't across the board happening. So there was clearly something a little off about the algorithm, but wasn't happening to everyone.
Yeah, I can. I don't know if David Herman will. He doesn't always like being called out in a positive way, is what I'm going for here. But I love getting his updates on basically a daily basis of the bugs and issues that he's seeing on the platform. And it does seem like it's nonstop. There's always something going on, something changing, even if it's not maybe impacting the entirety of the shape of the spend and the result of that spend.
I think it's hard. There's going to be a theme in this conversation, I think, as we reflect on 2024 versus 2023. And this is always the challenge with year-over-year data, is you're just asking a question of two things in context to one another. And sometimes that's as much about the comparative data set as it is about the present data set, right? And so you can look at, and I think, Yarden, you did a good job there of zooming out a little further, because the narrative of the year-over-year for 22 versus 23 matters a lot in this story too.
Yeah.
Where that was such a hard year. And I think that's really an underreported story in e-commerce, is that 22 is when the bottom fell out. It's when the what is the phrase? The rooster came home to roost. I don't know what the phrase is, but that's really when we started coming down hard off of the post-COVID wave. And you were really right in the middle of the iOS issues. People didn't know how to handle things. It was really a challenging time for sure.
Yeah, Taylor, with that, I'm curious what you think about what going to some news that came out last week talking about the zombie brands, I believe was the term that was used. When we look at 2024 and it being overall slightly positive from 23, do you think what we're seeing there is just the impact of what happened in 2022 finally playing out, or do you think there's something else that involved there? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's a bunch of factors that are contributing to each of those environments. And so much of growth in e-commerce comes from a brand's capacity to produce consistent new customer acquisition at a rate that they can afford, right? And so the amount of growth that occurs is usually a slight lagging indicator to the previous period's efficiency of acquisition. And so the reason 22 becomes such a challenge, it's really the lagging indicator to the post-iOS world on's inability to efficiently acquire new customers, right? And so that is when it catches up with you, when all of a sudden you can't survive on your existing customer revenue anymore, and it just sort of bottoms out really quickly. And it takes a while to rebuild that growth, right? And so 23, you see new customer acquisition grow again. This year, we're continuing to maintain it, but what we're seeing now is more of the growth today is coming from new customer revenue, but returning customer revenue, but new customer revenue is still positive a little bit. And so these things tend to be, whenever the acute issue happens to new customer acquisition, there's a lagging problem coming. It doesn't happen immediately because a lot of these brands can offset that in a short time with their existing customer base.
Yeah, and I would say one thing that I've noticed and throughout the course of what we've been looking at this year is just the fact that new customer revenue is struggling a little bit more for larger brands. And I think a lot of what we're hearing on socials is some of those brands. But I wonder, Taylor, how much of what we're seeing in terms of people being concerned actually really comes from that piece of it. But the fact that new customer revenue is up, it is positive, but it's not maybe as positive as brands would hope that it would be.
I also think the expectations of that cohort in particular, they're usually the people who have grown really fast up until this point, right? And so like they're also like just used to really big numbers. And so 18% feels like what the hell, like so I think it is a special group.
When you've been growing at 100% year over year for 4 or 5 years and then it just stopped happening, there is definitely probably an expectation shift that has from there. Steve, on the note of all of that, looking backwards at 2021, 2022, and some of the forward looking pieces of the impact there, I'm curious what you're seeing with consumer confidence from these other economic indicators that we've been tracking.
Yeah, the point that comes to mind regarding 22 is that we saw a bottoming out of the confidence index. The University of Michigan bottomed out in June of 22. OECD, Office of Economic and Cooperation and Development, bottomed out in like June and then went even lower in July of 22. So like it wasn't just iOS 14.5 and kind of the letdown from post-COVID world. It was also consumer confidence just dropped at that time. So I think there was that other aspect to it that kind of led to 22 being a particularly rough year.
And what is it looking like, now in relation to 2022 and 2023?
Yeah, we've seen kind of a continuous rise, like particularly since last on our own DTCCI, we kind of saw that bottom out kind of in the fall time, which is normally a typically D2C lull or doldrum in a way, and then kind of been rose up obviously for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. And we've seen the first half of the year have particularly rising confidence and Q2 looking better than Q1 in terms of that confidence index. And a lot of that can be tied. I think we have a really good chart in our newsletter of the economic sentiment of the consumers that we're surveying versus stock market, basically, and seeing a very good correlation between those.
Everything we do at CTC is about helping you create predictable, profitable growth. And you've heard us talk about margin innovation and how the next wave of growth in our industry is going to come from finding ways to improve your business margin over time. RichPanel will help you do just that. RichPanel provides high-quality, AI-powered customer support that allows you to 10x your volume of customer support 24/7 around the world. And it's not just for customer service. Their ad moderation product feature is also on the way. RichPanel will save you money without sacrificing any quality of experience for your customer. Check them out at richpanel.com.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too that, in doing some research for this episode, I forgot the term. So looking at this, inflation has been stabilizing, right? So if you look at the chart, there was a pretty massive spike, and you look at basically like end of 2021 through mid 2023. There's a inflation is just through the roof. If you look back over the last 20 years, it's peak inflation for that time period. And so even just looking at what we're seeing now, like that's come down a little bit. It's still higher than it was, and I'm sure that's going to continue to have some lagging impact. But it is interesting seeing that. I've seen other people sharing information about things like the savings that people have. So there was a lot of excess savings during COVID. And so all of this stuff is kind of coming back to normal. And so it will be interesting to see. I mean, what we're seeing is 2024, when you look at all the macroeconomic indicators, it is better than 2023 was. But I wonder how much of this uncertainty is actually coming from the fact that it's better, but savings are running out. Inflation is coming back down, right? Like there's still a lot of uncertainty about like, what is this actually going to look like in months or 12 months, even if confidence is higher than it's been.
Yeah. And inflation is a weird one, right? Because the decrease of inflation generally is related to a decrease in demand, right? So there's something signaling to us. And if you think about what the Fed's trying to do, it's really that, right? They're actually trying to raise unemployment and drive down demand in order to get inflation under control. And so there is a consumer signal that is sort of inverse to a market sentiment where we're like, oh yeah, interest rates are going to be cut. Awesome. But that means that there's a general struggle in the economy that's driving demand down at a way that's like, ooh, okay, that could actually be a counter signal to our universe. And that's where I think some of this, like, there's all these ways to glance at this, and we're trying to narrow it into the direct to consumer confidence index, because I think the broader market sentiment is affected by a lot of things that may actually, in some cases, be inversely correlated to the way that we actually think about the market and where consumers would be spending.
Yeah. And
Yeah, you can take like a tangible example of something that always surprises me in the data that we're looking at is inflation. You know, we see it every day is skyrocketing, but if you look at the data, actually like AOV have it increased dramatically in the past couple of years, which you would have expected go hand in hand, you know, with the rest of the inflation rates, but they're not, because for some reason there's not a correlation to, or there's not a very clear correlation to, you know, a meal at the Cheesecake Factory versus, you know, skin cream online.
Absolutely. Steve, did you have another comment you were going to make there?
Yeah. I mean, that also reflects how D2C can be a different dynamic than the overall economy. We saw that obviously in Q2 of 2020 when like D2C did fantastic, but the overall economy was tanking. Like we're in a different world. So some of the factors that would be great for us are horrendous for the overall economy.
Yeah,
and I think that one of the
point
things
on that, but looking at the direct consumer confidence index, I'm going to call this out specifically because I think it's interesting. When we layer that in with, I believe, the Michigan confidence index that you included in here, we do see that while the overall trend lines are similar, our index is very much focused on the impact on online spend, right? So what we see is our index has a big spike in Q4. And that's actually like part of that is confidence. The confidence was rising, but part of that's actually that we're seeing better return on ad spend and better spending happening during that time frame. So ours is a little bit disconnect from the overall, and this is actually where year over year this is going to start to become really interesting, I believe. So we now have on that index starting in mid-March, basically, of 2023 is when we started tracking this data. So as of March forward, we now have year over year data. So for us, what's been really interesting of looking at that, I believe that is up, I want to say 6% year over year is what we're looking at for that index specifically. The others are up as well, and you can definitely go look at all that in the report, but it is good to see that. And I think that will be really interesting to look at when we hit Q4. What are we seeing year over year this year? Is it better or worse than it was last year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that's going to be fantastic to take a look at. And like, obviously we see the difference already in the first half of the year. Well, more specifically Q2. And as we kind of rise, whereas like last year we saw it kind of starting to decline in June and going into July, like last year. This year we're kind of seeing the consumer confidence index that we publish significantly higher, actually trending upward rather than trending downward.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Have you ever seen, sorry, last thing on this inflation topic, have you ever seen the chart that's like regulated categories price over time versus unregulated categories over time? And it's like healthcare is like inflated the most in price, but the TVs alternatively have gone to basically zero in price. And I actually think it's not just government regulation. It's also like competition, which is sort of what regulation limits. So it's in some ways a proxy for another, but our industry has a lot of deflationary dynamics like this, where prices get driven to zero because somebody is willing to take less and less and less and less and less and less margin. And if you think about like Temu and Shein and these different things that sort of drive, and Amazon generally, like I just look at like the joke I always talk about is like silicone wedding rings. When we started and we were selling one of them for $19.99, and now you can buy 10 of them for $1. Like a lot of the things in e-commerce are less affected by this process because there's such highly competitive spaces that someone's willing to take less and less and less margin all the way down to the break-even point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually,
but there is the flip side of venture money leaving the industry. So
totally, it doesn't fund that same dynamic as aggressively, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. But obviously, foreign players and people that have, are able to produce these with much lower margins. It's a great point.
And Yarden, you think that would impact AOV, or do you think that's really just a matter of like total dollars being put into like total volume of the industry, not necessarily like an individual brand changing their AOV?
I think it would impact AOV. Look, I think like at some point, if you think about, a D2C company is a business like any other company, right? Like they need to take out money past their marketing spend to pay their employees. And, people also want to take money home from it. And so if you have a certain margin that gives you that profit, which, hopefully these companies do have, you're able to keep eating at it to grow your business. And at some point, you can't take it off anymore. But, until we get to that point, the AOV can keep going down as the industry becomes more competitive, because if not, then you're just not going to be able to sell it.
Well,
Or, the flip side, well, we've seen a lot of like we've done a lot of analysis on like what creatives are working the best and things in this current period. And we have seen, Taylor, we spoke about this offline a couple weeks ago. Like, we have seen a lot of the flip to like, my product is not cheap. Don't buy my product if you're looking for something cheap, like that negative to say that your product is expensive, your product is luxurious. Like, there is something to the dynamic of like a lot of things that are very cheaply made and you can buy a ton of, instead you want to buy one in quality, and that marketing is working. So there's more and more brands positioning themselves as having that, being able to then hold their AOV or even increase it.
yeah. And on that point, so looking at the gifting trend data, one thing that is very interesting in 2024 is that we are seeing higher AOV for people who are giving gifts. And to be clear here, what we're looking at is the question, who is this purchase for? And if we look, we specifically are tracking people who said that they're buying for an other and buying for a family member. And that's kind of the measure that we use when we look at the impact of gifting and also AOV. And so what's been really interesting in 2024 is we're actually seeing gifting as a whole is a little bit lower than it was in 2023. People seem to be buying more, a larger percentage of purchase are for self as opposed to a gift. But what we're seeing is that at key gifting moments, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, the AOV climbs dramatically for people who are buying for a family member or a significant other. And I think that maybe speaks to what you're saying. The one time that you don't want to go cheap is when you're buying a gift for somebody, right? And so that's a really good opportunity actually for brands to say, okay, this is we're not going to make this something that's cheap. We want you to actually invest in the person that you're giving to. And in that context, maybe you aren't going to look for the deal all the time. You're going to actually look for the best gift for that person. So that's been an interesting trend that we've seen in 2024. All right, cool. So diving in a little bit more, I think we kind of briefly touched on this, but ASC and PMAX, I think is an interesting trend that we're seeing. Yarden or Taylor, did either of you want to jump in and give a little bit of commentary on that? We are seeing basically just a higher percentage of the ad spend on both Google and Meta going towards those the channels is not the right term, but being spent in those ways.
My lawyer has recommended that I no longer comment on Google-related advertising initiatives due to some recent conflicts. So I'll let Yarden handle this one.
I'll give some context. So obviously, over the past year and a half or so, Meta and Google released Advantage Plus and PMax respectively, which is their more automated AI-based targeting system. This has gotten rapid adoption, which makes sense. Both, one, it does solve a need for these companies, but also the ad platforms are pushing it pretty heavily. And so within a very short time frame, they're at about 35% of the share wallet for each of the individual ad platforms. So Advantage Plus, 35% of total Meta spend that we track, and PMax, very similar, 34%. And the difference between the two that we're seeing is Meta is continuing to grow their non-Advantage Plus part of the pie. So both are growing, where Google, it's more sort of zero sum, like people held their Google spend the same, but moved a lot of the dollars into PMax. And yeah, there's a lot of implications of what that means in terms of performance and where revenue starts coming from that we'll let Taylor get into.
Yeah, I think that we continue to just see ambiguity of actual incremental impact from both of these products in a way that people are now seeking out answers to. And I think that I have an appreciation that I think Meta has been more progressive in supporting that, the funding of that research to help answer the question faster, that Google's now deciding that they're going to have to step through the door because people just don't know what to do with their 5.5 ROAS on a PMax campaign. They just don't know how to interact with it. They don't know whether to scale it. They don't know whether to pull back. They don't know how actually to assess the impact. And so I think it's leaving them in a position of really being unclear on how to interact with the ad product. And so I think that they're going to their credit, and I think Zach Cox over there deserves a lot of praise for leading the charge on trying to advocate for advertisers. And I think that they are making and listening to some changes, or at least fighting to bring some more clarity. They're leaning into some product optimizations that could solve it. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than I've been, but it has certainly been a really challenging period to interact with the Google ad product.
Yeah, I mean, I think Meta has sort of less, like as we spoke about, Meta is pretty obviously incremental, right? Like it's the behemoth, the 70-80% of share wallet for these advertisers. They see they're putting dollars and dollars are coming back. And of course, you know, with attribution these days, it's unclear which exact campaign caused what. But it's quite clear that that's incremental, where Google, it is a smaller piece of the pie. You know, a lot of it comes from brand search, and then how do they hear about the brand? So it is a little more confusing. And same with TikTok, right? Where TikTok, it's most of the time you're not clicking in from the video, go to the website and buying as you are for Meta and Google. And also, you know, their stances, Taylor, do in a way make sense and speak to the position of you know, how these ads are delivered.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're right. Discovery happens on IG, and then demand capture happens in Google. These are just different stages of the customer journey, generally speaking. And so in that case, I can understand why Meta would be very proactive in saying, test our incrementality. Like, there's a real incentive there. And Google has created a system that is an obligation for a lot of us to participate in more than a desire to. And I think that's where I look at the product and go, like, that is not a place you want to be long-term for a customer. You don't want to be an obligation of spend. Eventually that gets innovated away because customers get dissatisfied. You want to be delivering value to people that they're excited about, that's making real business impact. So I think that's the challenge for them now.
Yeah. One thing that is interesting in some research that we've done, and we're not covering it in this issue, but if you go back to, I believe it's the May issue and look at this, Google has an impact on, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but customers who discover a brand on a different platform. So let's say they discover a brand on Meta or TikTok or Snap, and then go and search for that brand on Google. So they have looking at attribution survey data. So they say, I found this brand on TikTok, but then they have a Google click. Those customers actually have a higher AOV on average than customers who are coming direct from the platform. So there is an interesting thing here where, you know, for Google, the idea of it being a requirement essentially in order to do business was absolutely true. But at the same time, there is a reality that there can be a really positive impact from driving somebody through search, right? If somebody's doing research, that's kind of a necessary step in buying higher AOV products for most people. Not necessarily the case for everybody, but not many of us are going to go buy, well, at least I'm not going to go impulse buy, let's say, a $500 car seat, right? Like, I'm going to do some research on that. And so I may have discovered that through something like an ad on Meta. So incrementally, like, that's going to show an impact there for sure. But if I actually go do some research, read some other things, and then finally I come to that website through a Google search, there is that Google is still having a positive impact in that context. But it's just harder to know what that impact is because the incrementality of that is not going to show up in the same way, right? So it is really, I do, Taylor, to your point, you don't want to be the obligation, but it also doesn't mean that there is no value creation in that step, right? And so like I look at it in that context where, when from the attribution survey standpoint, which is kind of the primary piece of our business, I oftentimes tell people that Google is going to over attribute itself, but that doesn't mean that there's no value there. And so I think that's the balance that we're all trying to find with each of these platforms is what the actual value of the ad spend that's going into that. And are we under overvaluing it? And those are just very challenging questions to be able to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is the incremental efficiency of the channel, right? So that's really the question here is that I agree that there's probably incremental revenue created. The question is at what cost? And
Yep.
that is what I think people are really after is that you have to create incremental value in excess of your cost. And that is actually a really high bar. And in sitting in the position that Google does, I think that there are cases where those economics are inverted in a way that doesn't feel great.
Yep. And the problem with something like PMax is it just obfuscates it more, to your point, Taylor. So then there's a question of like, sure, this looks really good, but is it actually creating the incremental?
And I think kind of this has also led to more incrementality testing from our side too, to validate what the channel is saying. Because if they don't know that ROAS is true, or that the ROAS that PMax is reporting is actually creating incremental revenue for the brand, then the best way to test that out is like do a geo holdout from a third party.
Yeah. And I think when we do that, I'm going to speak in generalities, and I have an episode coming out with the CMO of Measured or CSO of Measured here next week, where I was trying to get him to give me sort of some general sense of things. But what I'll give you ours are from a few is that you see Meta, if you're using like on a click-based optimization, it's under-reporting its incremental impact, whereas PMax is over-reporting substantially. Like usually it's about a 30% incremental value relative to reported value on PMax. Now, there's 1,000 different structures, so like you have to be careful, but that's now the default number we use with a customer before we can get to a specific individual incremental study is now like 30%. It's a huge delta to
Like
the actual expectation.
the default knock that you put on it.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you tell me you have a 9-to-1, we're going to apply a 30% value before we get to the specific incremental study for your result, for your business. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say like that lines up with what we see on attribution surveys too. I know not everybody trusts those, but it's going to be pretty similar, right? The actual impact of, from a discovery standpoint, if you're talking about how somebody is discovering a product or a brand compared to ad spend. So
yeah. I think for the end of this, I'd love to. I think the real meat of this edition and what everyone should go after and really care about is like this giant same store year-over-year revenue growth data. Because I think that'll allow us all, and I'd be curious if we all did this as a group, is like, what do you believe? Assign an emoji to your sentiment. Where are you at? So maybe Jeremiah, can we go into that part of it?
That's exactly what I was thinking. I wanted to do that as well. So yeah, in terms of year-over-year growth, I mean, Yarden, we're seeing, I'll let you speak to it actually, but it looks solid from what we've seen.
I can explain what the analysis is. Taylor was on a 9 operators pod last week to go over this, so he could give the full overview. But basically, we took a bunch of data from various and different cuts of same store and the distribution, like of the actual stores, of how they grew or declined in the first half of 2024 versus the first half of 2023. To look at, instead of just looking at a median or an average change, what is going on across the board? What is happening to most e-commerce stores? And what we see is most are actually growing, but I'll let Taylor sort of dive into his analysis here.
Yeah, I think it's good. So one, there's a lesson here in measures of central tendency and the difference between median and mean here. That is really important.
Yeah.
And I actually have come to appreciate more and more that Barrows uses median more often. And especially when we think about percentages, like one thing to know is that positive percentages can go to infinity and negative percentages can only go to 100. So when you think about averaging, if someone tells you the average percentage growth of any data set, it's going to be weighted to the positive, like dramatically in our industry. And so it's almost a useless measure. Like I think if you looked at the average percentage growth year over year for the store, it's like 74% or some absurd number that if I just gaslit you all into saying that number, it would be like a great headline and would be factually true, but would be, I think, a really insufficient way of telling the story. Because at the same time I could say that, I would say that the median growth number, and I don't have it, is 9%, I believe. Am I saying that right? Across all the stores. I'm not going to give them the category slices, but across all stores,
Yeah, 10%.
10%, right? Those are very different outcomes. And then on top of that, another thing I'll say is that roughly 50%, and this is the bulk of the data, are plus or minus 10%. So the majority of stores are roughly flat. I'm guessing none of them had 10% growth goals this year. They probably had more than that. The tails are large. The median's about 10% and the mean 74. And so as you put that all together and you start to analyze it, you can see why a lot of people might be feeling stagnant. They kind of feel stuck. And that's a lot of the story that you hear on Twitter and what might be the case. But there's also a large contingent of people that are winning. I was on a podcast this week with Ryan Bartlett from True Classic Tees, and he's like, me and a bunch of my people are all in a text thread going, we're smashing. What's going on with everybody, right? Like, so there are people on tails here, and whatever community you aggregate in, you're likely going to seek out people that have a similar narrative or experience to your own. We all are guilty of that. But that's why I think this data is so beautiful, is because you see each node of a very large sample, and you can see just that how many different stories there are, and then you can start to analyze it a lot of different ways.
Yep, absolutely. And in terms of the takeaway, on my side, I would say I'm optimistic. I don't think we're going to feel good about things this year. I think 2024 will not be a feel good year. I would say, like, for my own business, it's the same thing, right? Everything still feels challenging, but I think I'm optimistic about 2025. And I would say, 2024 is, like, if I look at the data, it looks like it's okay, right? It's just not 2021. And I think it's going to take some time. Even if you look at one more quick note too, I don't think we have ever shown this chart in anything that we do, but if you look at the share of commerce that's happening online and you look at the charts, right? There's that, everybody's seen this chart, and the share of commerce is climbing over time. And you see this massive spike in 2020 and then it drops, right? And then it starts to come back up. And so we still we're below that curve still, right? And so I think, we're still ahead of the curve, but the growth is happening very slowly. And so I think, like, what we're going to start to see is next year probably is when that could normalize and it will start to feel more normal again. That's my hope. I just don't think we're going to see it this year. I think it's just going to be a sort of the same sort of cautious optimism that 6 months from now I think are going to look really good. Steve, where are you at?
I feel pretty optimistic. It's going to be interesting too. We were looking at Q4 and how Cyber Monday falls into December this year. So it's a very compressed kind of holiday season that we'll have. The holiday gifting season gets compressed. And then on the front end of that, November has the election that is going to take away. And we'll talk about that in the next issue, where it increases CPMs some, but I think it also takes away interest. If everyone's focused on the election and focused on those sort of issues, they're probably less likely to purchase. I remember seeing in our own data that purchase week of the election didn't look so hot in terms of customer acquisition.
How about you, Yarden?
Yeah, I was in this month when we looked at the past 4 years instead of just the last year. I was actually happy to see that we are not nearly back from the base. Like, we are not nearly where the peak was, where if you think about, like, the S&P 500, we've already crossed the peak, like, after the drop, and a lot of other metrics we have. But here we haven't. Here we're still, it's a decent year. It's not a terrible year. There's not alarm bells ringing. Businesses are still alive. Most of them are still in the positive. They're not in the negative. And there's still a lot of room to grow, and we'll keep going. I know there's an article about zombie businesses and stuff. I think people need to remember from those type of articles, like, that happens, and that is what industries are, like, and startups, that's like that. I mean, yeah, there's companies that people start and they fail and they close, and a lot of them. And there's also a lot that succeed. Like, that's just That's just how it is. And now it may be more because the funding cycle is different than what it was, and people are at the tail end of funding that they had, and they're not able to raise again at the valuations that they had. But like in general, I think that there's more room to be optimistic, and we see by the numbers that there's a lot of places to grow.
For sure.
The other thing to remember is we're just talking about online store growth, right? We're not talking about wholesale growth. We're not talking about retail growth. We're not even, I think this specific data set US only, Yarden?
No,
It's global.
it's global,
Okay.
but most of the revenue is US based.
Yeah. So I think that when businesses think about pursuit of growth, I think that not very many people still exist in this idea that all of the business growth forever should come from your direct channel. I think more and more we're an industry normalizing to a more omni-channel distribution as a business and trying to meet customers where they're at. And I'll include social commerce in that, which there's a really cool little insight in your this month's edition about share of wallet by specific spend channel, like isolating Instagram feed versus Facebook Reels versus TikTok Shop versus other things. That I think that's a category that I continue to be bullish on. And so there's lots of other ways that these businesses are growing. So to see growth out of just that channel, I think is a positive indicator for our industry that I look at and go, okay, relatively, this is positive, maybe not peak hysteria or holy fast, this is the fastest growing business sector in the United States. None of that necessarily, but growth with the opportunity to continue to move forward and brands succeeding, some failing, and then a bunch in the middle. So that's about it.
Yeah, totally. And on the point of what you were describing, Yarden, I mean, there's all those stats that have existed forever. 9 out of 10 businesses fail. Something like only 10% of businesses ever hit $1 million a year in revenue, all that kind of stuff. So we are really looking at an industry where there's a lot of people that are hitting these successful milestones and doing really well. And even in that, there's always going to be some drop off. Cool. Well, I think, yeah, that's been a fun one. Again, I think, the numbers that we see are looking positive, and it's definitely check out the episode. There's some really good stuff that kind of contextualizes all of this over time, looking at the ad spend, revenue, the confidence of consumers, all of these things. So in this context, let's see, Taylor, I believe we have a code, right? I did not see.
Summer 50.
There we go. Yeah.
It's sunshine and rainbows over here. Summer 50 gets you 50% off. And this is going to be the biggest, I think it's the largest issue. We're constantly having to hack down the number of graphs because we're reaching email limitations, but this is a big one.
And I will say too, if you are subscribed, you do get access to the historical issues. So in this issue, we're referencing back to a few different things that we've looked at in the past to definitely make sure that you get this issue, look it over, and then go back in the archive and take a look at some of these other things that we've looked at. There is a lot here. I mean, it's going to be 150 plus pages, I think, that we're at by the time that those, or maybe not quite that, 100 plus pages of total research that we're going to be looking at here. So lots of interesting data going back to the beginning of this year. Well, I think that's it. Thank you all, and hope you have a wonderful July.